Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of the Spring 2025 webinar series, which is focused on Generation Z. My name is Gary Dievska. I'm an associate professor of biochemistry and molecular biology in the College of Osteopathic Medicine at Sam Houston State University, and I'm also the chair of the Association of Biochemistry Educators Professional Development Committee that organizes this webinar series. We are very excited to have Jim Martindale with us today to share his experience with assessment and Generation Z learners. My PDC colleague, Anna Blender from the University of South Carolina School of Medicine in Greenville, will serve as the moderator of today's session. She will introduce our speaker momentarily, but first let's go over some of the ground rules and announcements. Please keep your microphone muted and feel free to keep your camera on. Please enter your questions into the chat, and my PDC colleague Emily from Marion University College of Osteopathic Medicine will monitor the chat and will facilitate the Q&A session at the end. Now I'll turn it over to Anna to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Yes, my name is Anna Blenda. I'm a professor at University of South Carolina School of Medicine, Greenville, Department of Biomedical Sciences. I'm also a module director for Foundations of Medicine 1, thread leader for genetics content, and also director of research at our medical school. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Martindale, who is an associate professor of medical education and director of assessment at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He earned his PhD in educational research from the University of Virginia with concentrations in statistics and psychometrics. Dr. Martindale has been involved in medical education for the past 30 years, primarily focusing on assessment in undergraduate medical education. His primary research interests include the psychometrics of knowledge assessment, multivariate statistics, combinatorial statistical models, and predictive modeling. So we're very, very honored and pleased to have Dr. Martindale join us today. And I'm turning things over to Jim.
Thank you, Anna. That was very kind of you. And I see a couple people that I know here. So Renee Chozet is here and Anna's here. And I think I have a former colleague who's going to attend today. So thank you so much for having me today. What an honor to speak to this group. And I want to keep this informal. Please feel free to chime in if that doesn't break the rules. I don't want to break the rules, but by all means, if there's a question, whatever, please ask. And I told people earlier, I'm available to stay later if people want to discuss anything. Please share the slides, do whatever you want with them, and let's get started, okay? So thank you again for having me. Let's talk a little bit about Gen Zers. And the reason I know you guys are focusing on learning with Gen Zers, and there's a lot of kind of controversial things being said about Gen Z learners. So I want to just put some things out there. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time with it, but I want to make sure that we're kind of all speaking the same language. And certainly from an assessment perspective, this is extremely important that we understand this generation. They are different from all previous generations. We see it every day at our School of Medicine. I'm sure you guys see it also. Frontline scientists and teaching your students. I'm sure that you have seen the, let's say, frustrations that we maybe are seeing with some of our Gen Z learners. It's very different from the way old people like me, we didn't learn like this. So, and I will say that I've had an interest in Gen Z ever since I had kids. My wife and I, we have 3 Gen Z boys that are all grown now. But it was fascinating to see their educational trajectory as Gen Z learners. A bit frustrating for mom and dad, but interesting nonetheless. So let's just make sure that we know what we're talking about. these are who we're talking about. Okay, so these kids in their 20s, for the most part, they're coming through. They are considered the first true digital natives. Now, that used to be a positive. I'm not so sure it is anymore. There are pluses and minuses to that. This is the most diverse generation in US history, which for me is a hugely positive thing. Work-life balance. Now, on the surface, I think we can all agree that's probably a positive. However, in the medical world, it's not always a positive, and we're seeing some problems with that. A clerkship director told me last night at one of our meetings that, this student, they really don't want to stay past 5 o'clock, and they cite work-life balance. Kind of a problem when you have to do your roundings and all your patient notes, right? Okay. They are more prone to anxiety. They do tend to place a larger emphasis on mental health, which I think is a positive. Why they're more anxious? We don't actually know. There's a lot of discussion about this in the literature right now. The short attention spans, I'm betting you all see this. I know I see it with our students too. Okay, so let's look a little bit at kind of focusing on these learner characteristics. I have to do this because we can't assess what we're not trying to learn. So remember, assessment drives learning, and they are tightly woven. So we have to know what we're talking about before we can start thinking of assessment modalities and data analysis. Teamwork is huge. Now, I'm assuming at your institutions you have some form of integrated teamwork within your curriculum. Could be team-based learning, problem-based learning. You may use IRATs and GRATs and things like that. Peer feedback is really important. And in fact, as we get through these characteristics, a lot of these have guided what we're doing here at UVA for our clerkship period in our UME curriculum to more embrace a lot of these characteristics. And I'm happy to talk about that later if anybody would like to know more. This one, factual accuracy, this is something we've been studying. And the reason that we have been studying this is because we have an honor code here. We have a student-run honor code that has been at UVA for, I think, 170 years, something like that. And the idea of cheating, plagiarism, things like that, it's taken very seriously, and students can be expelled for that. However, what we're finding is that a lot of Zoomers, what we would consider plagiaristic behavior, they don't. And it's not because they're nefarious in any way. It's because it's not something they were brought up with. Okay, so it's important to understand that. And that was my next point there. Learning plans. This is something, again, that Anna's laughing. Individual learning plans. Now, we're one of we're institutions, I think there are 12, that we received a AMA Precision Education grant. And so precision education, if you're hearing those buzzwords, a lot of it is around ILPs, individual learning plans. This one is huge. We see this all the time. Do you guys have recorded lectures and things like that? Students love it. Why? What is one of the main reasons they love this? Because they can speed it up. Remember, short attention spans. You can make these lectures 1.5 times speed, 2 times speed. I find that a little alarming, but I also think that YouTube is an amazing tool. My youngest son, when he was learning calculus, he had a terrible teacher, so he taught himself calculus with YouTube. There you go. And rote memorization, folks, out the window. Now, for the work that basic scientists do, memorization is an incredibly important component. You're not going to get around that. However, I'm going to bring up later ideas that might help with getting students to memorize and not telling them you need to memorize, okay? And then immediate feedback. Now, when I say immediate feedback, I'm really talking about immediate assessment feedback too. And students are really, really kind of raging about, I want to know what I did. How did I do? So much so that when we have an assessment meeting, they're usually on Mondays to discuss a summative examination that our students have taken over the weekend. The students know when we're meeting. They literally will be there trying to see what's going on before we're even done. And that to me is, I'm still trying to figure that one out. There's immediate and there's kind of weird. I think that's kind of weird. So I wanted to show you this. This is from the Educational Research Division of Pearson, and they've done some really interesting studies. And this is just looking at Gen Z and millennials for preferred learning tools. Now, of course, the one that concerns me the most, and I guess I need to deal with this, would be books and the decline in the usage of books. As you can see in my background, this is one of UVA's libraries. I am a huge book fan, a huge library fan. So that kind of breaks my heart a little bit, to be honest with you. But you can see that of this, I think this was about a 5,000 student sample, and 59% of these Gen Zers had YouTube as their primary learning modality. So something that we need to keep in mind. Don't confuse that, by the way, with visual learners. Okay. And again, here's another one showing about your significant role in Gen Z learners and traditions and supplemental learners and tools. Again, this whole thing, how much time you spend on YouTube? Wow, that's a lot of time. 3+ hours a day. This is a unique generation. This is from the same study, by the way, but again, this would provide evidence to show you what we're talking about with how your curriculum can adjust for team-based activities. We have very few students that want to study alone. I don't know how your institutions are, and it's not across the spectrum of students. There are demographic differences in the way students study in terms of teamwork. That's not just a one-size-fits-all. I think this is one that we really need to take note of. Look at the last graph. Listening in a classroom or lecture. I happen to like lectures. However, I think the take-home point for this is, if you don't have a value-added component to your lectures, students won't come unless you make them. Now, we don't have mandatory attendance here in our School of Medicine unless it's a patient presentation. But the number of students that attend has plummeted. We generally have a class of between 150 and 160. We are lucky to get 30 students for an in-person class. Okay. Again, I think I will actually pass on these next two slides, looking at the distribution of different technological tools. But again, you all have this. So, all right. And we're going to start moving more towards assessment and data now. I want you to look at this feedback loop, because we have had to alter our assessment systems to take advantage of this feedback loop. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. Students wanting immediate feedback, affirmation, confirmation on what they've done or what they missed, and then moving forward to learn the material. This cycle seems to be even speeding up. So for example, one of the things that we do with our online testing system, so we have a proprietary system that we developed for administering all of our knowledge-based assessments. You can do other things with it as well, but for example, a summative exam opens on Friday, it closes on a Sunday. I analyze the data Sunday night, we meet on Monday, we get grades out by Tuesday. That's just the way it works. Within the system, as a student is moving through, say, a 90-item summative exam, they get feedback on every question they missed right at the end of the exam. As soon as they submit the exam, they get all the feedback. That's something that we instituted because of this feedback loop. Okay, so that's that. I'm starting to see that at more institutions now. Okay, so for learning modalities, and then this is tough when you teach biochemistry, for example. Not sure why that went away. Okay, projects. Project work is becoming huge. Group project work, presentations, short answer. Now, I don't mind any of these. It's difficult for some areas. For example, when I work with our anatomists, a lot of these don't work. So it has to be taken within your context. Short quizzes. Now, we could have an entire day discussion on formative assessment, but I'm going to tell you right now, formative assessment needs to be the bulk of your assessment strategy. Your summative, higher stakes assessment, super important here. Generally speaking, high stakes assessment is about 40%, 60% of our students' UME grades. So it's still a big deal, but I wouldn't make it 95%. Okay. Formative assessment is really kind of the way everything is moving. And true formative assessment doesn't have grades attached to it. So I'll let you stew on that one for a while. Practical application. Now, this is where you can really make a difference if you're giving like an MCQ test with biochemistry. You can really focus on the practical application, which is something Gen Z learners absolutely say they want in all the research. How do I link this to the real world? You can do that. And I'm going to give you a resource for that before we're done today. Okay, so feel free to speak up, anyone. I'm curious as to how you are assessing your learners. So maybe we can take a couple minutes and we can just hear what some people say. Hopefully
Jim,
someone has something. Yeah, Emily?
yeah, well, there's just one question from the chat.
Yeah.
And so they were asking, can you say again which assessment platform you use?
Oh, sure. Assessment platform?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct.
So, okay, we developed a proprietary system, so it's homegrown. We were looking, I'd say this was probably about 12 years ago, we were looking at ExamSoft as our primary delivery system. I actually voted for ExamSoft and I was overruled, and it had to do with the way that we wanted our testing system to link to our learning objectives. So we developed our own system. Now we use Oasis for some stuff as well, which I think maybe some people here use Oasis as well. It works well for some things, but yeah, we're a proprietary system. But I'm assuming a lot of people on the Zoom today use ExamSoft because they are like the number one, I think, in the United States. ExamSoft is great. It does give you some really good output. There's some things that I don't like about it from an analytics perspective, but it does give you some really good information. For example, distractor analysis is very important, and I believe it gives you that. So what's how are you assessing your students though? MCQs, multiple choice tests, is that one of the primary methods? Yep.
Jim, there's some stuff in the chat. Do you want me to share?
Yeah, could you do that?
Yeah,
That would be
absolutely.
great.
Yeah. So we have, so they do item assessment before, let's see, here we go. So were the questions fair before releasing any exam information?
Yep.
They generally release scores the same day as an exam. Is this
Excellent.
a problem? Is this a problem for this generation of students, as in too slow? Is their question.
Yeah, I mean, you need a policy on this, and our policy is grades are posted within 48 hours of the end of the assessment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so others use practice quizzes. There are 3 to 4 questions per lecture, and then an overall formative assessment.
Fantastic.
Formative, summative assessments, they use ExamSoft, Kahoot, and Quizlet.
All great.
Mostly multiple choice questions. Then we have immediate feedback on formative midterm that do not count, but not for the summative exam, since there may be retakes for failures, and we feel
Right.
that students finding out which ones they got wrong right away would be considered, quote, remediation, since they can do targeted studying after their failure to prepare for the retake. The retake is just supposed to determine if the first grade was accurate. And then
Interesting.
multiple choice, immediate feedback, board style multiple choice quizzes and exams, fill in the blank lab exams, faculty observation of behaviors in lab, and then peer assessment.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, all those sound great. Yeah, it's remediation. That's an interesting topic because for example, we give all the immediate feedback, but we don't share our summative assessment items. A typical summative assessment has we generally assess about 30 items per week of instruction on a summative exam. So a 3-week system has 90 questions to it, plus 10 to 15% added on for pilot studies. And we do that so we can build up our item bank. One of the weaknesses of our approach has been a heavy lift for our instructors to develop enough items. And fortunately, AI is helping that. So I would strongly recommend people, if you're not using AI tools for item generation, please do. Some of them are better than others. And if you do go that route, please make sure that you vet those questions with your faculty first, so you're not putting a lot of hallucinations out there, that's for sure. But yeah, so that's great. It sounds like most people are falling right in line with the typical assessment strategies. And MCQs, they get a bad rap. They shouldn't. I mean, like anything else, there are good MCQs and there are not so good MCQs. At the end of my PowerPoint, I put a link in there to the NBME item writing guide. If you're not familiar with that, you should be familiar with that. It's the current best practices involved in writing assessment items in the medical school world. And what they do with MCQs is fantastic. If you follow that and you're trying to get your students prepared for boards, that's the way to do it. Okay.
Jim, there's a couple questions in the chat, if that's okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first question, is there a connection between the way the Gen Z students are learning to the lower step 1 scores and the feedback from clerkship directors that the students are less prepared when they arrive to clerkships?
Yeah, interesting. We don't really have the data anymore about the relationship with step 1 since it went past fail. I think what we're going to see is a much heavier emphasis on step 2 now, because that still has a score. And honestly, we just had a talk about this yesterday with Martin Pusick from Harvard. And, step 1 was never intended to be used the way it was used. Never. So it was a misapplication of that instrument. It didn't have validity evidence associated with it for the way people are using it. It was designed in a different way. So the fact that it's pass fail, probably a good thing. I think it's still a little too early to know. But the second part of that, in terms of preparation for clerkships, I can only speak to my experience in the literature I've seen about this, but there does seem to be a rising tide of clerkship directors, clerkship faculty that think students are less prepared. So that is, I think, a real concern. And I mean, I can go off on another tangent and tell you what we're doing about that. For example, we have a course that we instituted that it serves as a bridge course between UME curriculum and hitting clerkships. That's one thing that we've done. You can also do other things starting from the very beginning in your world by making your MCQs relevant within clinical contexts. So that's probably the best piece of advice I can give this group for people that are, maybe you only interface with students their first semester in med school, something like that. If you can make your learning environment applicable to a clinical context, that will really help.
Okay, thank you. And then what AI software do you use for generating questions?
Sure. So we have 2 tools that we are sanctioned to use. And I'm convinced that one of them is because we have a contract with them and that's why they're forcing us to use it. That would be Microsoft Copilot. I'm not a big Copilot fan personally, nothing against Microsoft. I've just seen too much variability in when you just look for yourself. put a prompt in, and then just keep doing the prompt and see what happens. So we have a tool that we purchased from a group in Canada that's called Speak AI. It's a small company, and it's phenomenal. We use it for narrative assessment, we use it for qualitative research, and we're using it for item generation. I love it. Again, Speak AI. We also use Anthropic. There's a couple other models that different people are using. Oh, there was one, it just escaped me. A colleague who used one yesterday for image generation. It was incredible. If I think about it, I'll let you know. But yeah, those are some of the big ones. A lot of people use ChatGPT around here. Some people use ChatGPT Pro now. The problem with it is we're not allowed to use it for any student-related data processes. It's our legal counsel said, no, don't do it. So one of the reasons we went with Speak is because we have a contractual agreement with them that says they will not use our data for the development of any of their models. So keep that in mind with whatever tool you use. You have that right to say, yeah, we'll use your tool, but you're not allowed to use our data in the development of your models. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And then going back kind of to the connection between the step one and being prepared, there was a question about Gen Z and critical thinking.
Yeah.
Is there,
Gen Z and critical thinking. On the one hand, I have found Gen Z learners, and there's some research to back this up too, maybe more critical thinking in their problem-solving approaches because they place an emphasis on, number one, getting multiple perspectives, and number two, they really they incorporate feedback and they move at a rapid pace. So that all helps critical thinking. Now, on the downside of that is a lot of times when they get involved in these cycles of answering a question, getting feedback, learning again, answering a question, repeating that cycle, they do it so fast that they're missing things. They tend to lock into one area or another at the expense of the bigger picture. So in many cases, you need to slow them down. And that doesn't mean go tell them to read a chapter. It just means that you're going to have to prompt them more. And we are having to do that a lot more. They get very anxious if they don't get immediate results. So this is kind of a garbage in, garbage out metaphor where we've built this. We have to own this right now. Okay, we're going to give them immediate feedback. Well, that reinforces the fact that they don't have patience. They don't want to wait, right? That also applies to critical thinking. So the ability to take a step back, take in multiple sources, multiple opinions, and formulate your strategies for answering questions. They do it, but I would argue they do it at a speed that they miss things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, let me show you some recommendations that I have that I hope you will find helpful. So the incorporation of regularly applied low-stakes formative assessments, that's pretty clear in the literature by this point. And one of the ways that you can reduce anxiety is to use actual formative assessment. Now, real formative assessment has two components that I think are really, really important. Number one, it doesn't have grades attached to it. Now, I assume people here have read some of John Norsini's work, and John and I have had many conversations about what constitutes formative assessment. One of the things that really needs to happen is you need to take that pressure of a grade away. Students need to know what they're learning for, what's at the end of all of this. Every week you have a quiz. It's not graded, but it's building towards something. They need to know what that something is. And then the other thing I would say is that with real formative assessment, if you're going to do it right, you have to complete what we call the feedback loop. So if you are giving a low stakes quiz, 10 multiple choice questions looking at the Krebs cycle, and students complete it, and then you're like, okay, well, now I know you need to learn this, and I need to make sure I'm teaching this because that's the point, is to make sure there's congruence there, and you leave it at that, that's not real formative assessment. Real formative assessment means you provide feedback. So it doesn't have to be calling them into your office, but if you're giving a formative quiz, you need to give them the answers when it's done and tell them why something is not correct. If you're providing that feedback in a low anxiety environment, that's what we're talking about, okay? That's formative assessment. And again, expectations. This generation, more than any generation before it, wants to know what you expect of them. What are the rules? What's the outcome? We have to be so clear about this that frankly, it gets maddening sometimes. You know, you have to tell them every single thing. And again, we built this. We did it with learning objective-based models within the curriculum. Now, I'm a big fan of learning objectives, but I'm betting your students are like our students, where if you try to ask them a question and it wasn't tied to a learning objective, you're going to hear about it. And that's not going to go well for you. So that's how tightly we've made this. And there's pros and cons to it. Encourage self-reflection. That's a big deal. I think it's something we all could benefit from. Self-reflection really helps when students are out of the pre-clerkship curriculum and in the clerkship. We actually are now asking our clerkships to engage some sort of assessment modality that focuses on a self-reflection. So that's kind of one of the up and coming things you're going to see more of in the literature. And again, I said this before, I can't say this strongly enough. Students, they kind of see through things now. If you don't have a reason for them to come, then don't be mad at them for not showing up to your lecture. Now, again, I come from the world where in 10 years of college, I don't think I ever missed a lecture, maybe once because I was deathly ill, but it just wasn't a part of what we did then, right? We didn't miss lectures. I mean, you went out of respect, you went because there was something that you were going to learn. But that's not how Gen Zers operate. So you have to have something that's going to make it worth their while. Otherwise, what are they going to do? YouTube. Okay. Okay. Do you want to ask some more things?
There's one question in the chat, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
They asked, if you are providing feedback in a low stakes environment, how do you get students to complete the formative assessments if there is not a grade tied to it?
That's a fantastic question. Fantastic question. Ideally, if we were teaching adult learners, it wouldn't be a problem. We did a study about 10 years ago, and we demonstrated that we don't have adult learners. However, our curriculum and many curricula around the country are based on the notion of adult learning theory. Well, guess what? You run into problems like the one that's being addressed in this question, right? How do you make them do this? So that's a hard one. Now, we try and address that through coaching. That's one way that you can do it. We have a coaching program, so students are assigned a coach as soon as they come in. That coach works with them on their learning plans and helps them every step along the way. So in the very first, what we call system, which is our Foundations of Medicine system, which has a lot of heavy biochemistry in it, by the way, if students bomb that first summative that they get, then the coach is going to say, look, you need to pay more attention to the formatives that lead up to that summative. Because one of the things that we have found is if we don't do that, our formative assessments are useless. I'm serious about that. Because what students will do is they will basically log into the system, run through the questions, get the feedback, and use it as a study tool for the summative, as opposed to using it correctly, which is to help make sure they're understanding the previous week's material. Again, they're already off to the end of maybe the system or looking at step one. You know, there's like a lot of impatience there. So that's a really tough one. But the only thing I have seen in the literature about that is the idea of coaching. And that's one reason why we've implemented that. And I think it's really helping. But it's intensive. It's resource intensive. And when you have clinicians as coaches, that makes it even harder, right? So I'm not going to tell you it's a panacea by any stretch, but I do think that kind of thing is what people are going to want to start doing more of. So, but it's not without its problems.
Okay, thank you very much.
And Emily, thank you so much for looking at the chats because I'm really bad at that. So
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer everyone's questions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So again, some more recommendations. Focus on these assessment modalities. All right, this is where things are going here. And I'm not gonna lie to you. Some of these are maybe not congruent with what you want to do or your material. So take it with a grain of salt, but understand that this is where, as a whole, this is where assessment is moving nationally, internationally, and I will say that medical education is always about a decade behind K-12. So we're just now getting into some of this stuff, okay? Portfolios. Now, portfolio assessment, I'm not so certain applies here, but some schools like Lerner, at Case, they do heavy portfolio assessment, and there's some real benefits to that. Again, if you're not doing portfolio assessment, though, that is a radical turn for you. Case studies. I love case studies. Case studies can be incorporated within your MCQs. So just remember that. Collaborative work. I see people all the time in a lot of talks that I give, and I see it here, people nodding. Yeah, collaborative projects. One thing you can do from a formative assessment perspective is make your formative assessments even group, make them collaborative. We do that now for all of our anatomy formatives, and it's working really well. We haven't, I think we probably have maybe 3 of our systems have taken that on as well. Now, if you want to have a grade attached to the formative assessment, this doesn't work because in the collaborative, it's much more like a GRAT, right? Everybody gets the same grade. But if you're not grading and you're using formative assessment the way it was intended, then that won't matter, okay? So collaborative projects, I think, can be a good thing. And this is where I put a lot of my time and effort is into properly designed and vetted MCQs. This is one of the primary areas that I do my research in. This is the system that one of the systems I oversee at the School of Medicine. So I'm more than happy to talk about that. And I do have an MCQ slide I want to share with you today too, okay? I think a lot of schools now do IRATs and GRATs, so we won't go into that, more collaborative work. Let's look at some data and some strategies here. I'm going to show you some things that I've been doing for the last couple decades. And the reason why I'm just now getting to this is because everything we've been talking about underpins this. It's all related. You cannot know what to assess if you don't know what your learners are like. This is something that Anna Blenda and I have had multiple conversations about. I asked them when I went down and did a talk with them, I said, well, what do your learners look like? How old are they? What's the racial ethnic makeup? How many women? All those questions. Now, I know I'm not supposed to talk about some of these things anymore in the current educational environment. However, if we were to sit here and say, one size fits all, that's a lie. We know that. We know some students come from really difficult backgrounds. We need to take all of that into account. So I'm going to show you a couple ways that I do that, and I do it because you want everyone to succeed, right? My feeling is once they get, if you let them into your school, not let them in, but if they come to your school, you have an obligation to them at that point, for better or for worse. It's like a marriage. Okay. Typical sources of useful data that I'm going to throw out there, and I hope your institutions have these data, and I hope they would share them with you. I also am not so naive as to know that that's not the case at all institutions. Demographics. Demographics are incredibly important. So much so that there's some people at UCSF that are developing some proxy measures for underrepresentation. Fascinating work that they're doing. Sex, gender, race, ethnicity, academic outcome measures. So looking at what students bring when they get to your medical school. I did a study of that here because our students were struggling in biochemistry early on. We want to know why. So I broke down their the biochemistry they'd had undergrad and in testing. And what that allowed us to do then is more focus our biochemistry. Okay. But you won't know that if you don't look at their scores. Undergraduate GPA, and again, the breakdowns, all of this stuff, generally speaking, I get all of my data from AMCAS. You can also get the MSQ, the Matriculating Student Questionnaire. So there are sources of these data. AMCAS every school gets. The question is, do you have access to it? If not, you should ask for it. And somebody should be very convincing as to why you shouldn't have access to those data. You should. Standardized test scores, very important. Not for the reasons a lot of people use them for. A lot of the predictive models with standardized test scores, again, going outside the intention of the test, are worthless, but it's really important for you in, let's say, a UME curriculum, even in GME, it's important. I'm going to show you a little bit about how I use this data, okay? Attitudinal measures. I used to not include that, but I do now. We've just found that it correlates highly with other measures. And I will tell you that using these data, I'll give you an example. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was able to develop some predictive models. Happy to explain the models if anyone wants to talk about them. Some predictive models where I could tell, now this was before step 1 went pass fail. I could tell you whether you would pass or fail your step 1 and your score with 97.6% accuracy at the end of the first semester. Now, I would think that would be useful to people. That would help inform your curriculum. That would help inform a lot of things. And as a matter of fact, it did. It helped us a lot. Okay. I use these data for that. Okay. This is why I'm saying if you can get hold of these data, I would refer to them as student attribute data as well as academic measures. It's incredibly valuable in helping you plan your assessment strategy. It also will be helpful in the generation of your learning objectives. Okay. And then, yes, I was saying from the AAMC, you can get AMCAS, MSQ. The bookend to the MSQ is the GQ, right? The Graduating Student Questionnaire. Your registrar contains a lot of data as well. We use, get a good relationship with your registrar. So I have one with ours, and we typically, I'll say, can you send me a report that shows how many students may be decelerated? Things like that. That's important for accuracy reasons. So there's a lot of reasons to have a good relationship with your registrar. Okay.
Jim,
Questions, Emily?
Yep, there are a couple questions. So the first question is, what do you use to evaluate the attitudinal measures?
So usually they are preformed instruments that have evidence of validation. I don't make my own attitudinal I don't do my own instruments unless I have to, because it's such a pain to do it correctly. So I don't do that. There are a lot of questions you can get, like from AAMC, that have on their preference data, attitudinal data from the AMCAS. So you can start right there. The other thing that you might have, we do a battery of tests, including attitudinal measures towards learning and things like that we give, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, so I'll have to get back to you on the name, but we give those during orientation. Those data go into a repository, and I use those data. That's kind of the process that I use.
Okay, thank you. And the second question for demographics, is it effective to look at these in aggregate, or would this be something more individualized?
Absolutely aggregation.
Okay.
It has incredible value for the individual, but you're going to get in trouble if you do that. For one thing, there could be FERPA violations. There could be a lot of violations where, depending on the makeup of your institution, you cannot put anything out there that would allow someone to identify a student. So no, everything I'm talking about is aggregated data, and identifiers are removed for all my analyses.
Okay, thank you.
This last point, this might be one of the single best things we ever did, was build a data repository. And I'm going to tell you right now, what a pain to do it. And it's expensive, but man, is it worth it. So here's the thinking behind that. We call ours the EDM, the educational data. I forget the last word that they're calling it now. It's a repository. The philosophy behind this is, from acceptance to graduation, wherever you measure a student and however you measure a student, those data should be in a repository, in a warehouse, for longitudinal purposes. Now, that's a huge lift when you think about everything that you're measuring over the course of, say, 4 years, but it is worth it. So if you want to start looking forward, even for curricular enhancement and development, to be able to look forward to say, I'll give you an example. At UVA, I can tell at the end of the first semester how students will do their second semester. I can tell from the end of their first year how they're going to do their second year. I can tell from the second year how they'll do in the first year in the clerkships. It feeds forward from admissions, okay? That's why it's so important. So if you can build something like that, please do. You can send me an email if you have questions about that. Again, ours is, we have a team of IT professionals that are devoted to the dean's office that make this work. But it's not for the faint of heart, certainly when it comes to the pocketbook. So, okay, so what do we do with these data? Here's some examples. Analytic strategies to help you with learner outcomes. Okay. Forward predictive modeling. I probably spend about a quarter of my time doing predictive modeling. And if people want to know what that means, I just put a couple buzzwords in there, but ask a question. I'm happy to answer that question about predictive modeling. It's kind of the, everyone's going around talking about predictive modeling these days. Well, guess what? It's been around forever. So I don't know why it's hot now, but this is what I meant, Emily, aggregated group comparisons. So looking at group A versus group B on a summative exam, that kind of thing. And again, when it comes to that kind of work, you can go backwards as well. So you can look, for example, let me put this in real world terms for you. 2 years ago, I believe, we had a female student that lodged a complaint. She said that male students on one of our EPAs, entrustable professional activities that we give, that male students were doing better. Now, when we talked to her, she had no hard evidence about this. It was from talking with her male peers. So the dean said, Jim, you need to look at this. So I did. Well, lo and behold, what did I find? It was the exact opposite. Females were doing better than males. So that's a real world example of what you can do with these data, okay? Covariate analysis. Now, if you have a stats background, then none of this should be that difficult for you. Maybe some of the forward predictive modeling might be something that you didn't learn. But if you don't have someone, find someone that can do this kind of work with you, okay? The covariate analysis has been really helpful for us as we have different campuses now. And so I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. But the kind of bottom line take home from that is saying, look, we have found Group A differs from Group B on a biochemistry summative exam. Well, let's find out where those differences lie. Oh, and by the way, what if we hold something else constant and then look? That's what I'm talking about. So for example, I found that our students have students that come into our medical school with a deficit in the biomedical aspect of the MCAT. When you drill down into the subcomponents and you look at the biochemistry portion, and students that have that deficit, those deficits continue unless you intervene. Okay, found that through doing covariance analysis and forward predictive modeling. This is up and coming, and all I can say is it's time consuming. I like narrative assessment. So think about having open-ended items along with MCQs. That's probably the most common way people do this, but narrative assessment is becoming really important at the clerkship level. And I would strongly suggest if you are looking at this kind of data, use AI to help because it's so time consuming. I don't know if anyone here has experience doing thematic content analysis or anything like that coming from the qualitative research world, but it's unbelievably time consuming, but AI can really help. For example, I had 600 pages of narrative feedback in one of our courses that we call it the Social Issues in Medicine course. And so I had 600 pages of narrative feedback that we wanted to look at. Well, honestly, that would have taken me a couple weeks to do by hand. And I put it in our Speak AI tool, and in a matter of about 5 minutes, we had something that we could then send out to our experts in the course to vet, and they confirmed it. So it's amazing what you can do on that side now. Okay, before I start this, are there any other questions, Emily, that anybody wants to ask?
There was one question that I missed. So going back to the attitudinal measures, they were wondering which constructs do you look at?
Yeah. So most of ours are focused around students' attitudes towards learning. So you can really think of that if you want to think about learning, and it is as a construct, it's a higher level psychological construct, then we base most of it around learning. Now, there is research being done. I would recommend you look at Daniel Willingham's work, and the notion of learning style is kind of going away. There's research to say that that's not really how we learn, that's not the case, but our instruments that we give, the things that we do looking at attitudinal measures are generally around things like learning preference, group work, things like that. We also do look at some of the variables that have been associated with adult learning style, and that's one way that we know we don't have adult learners. I mean, you can probably do it without collecting any data, but yeah, it's really good for that kind of thing. So what I'm showing you here is some de-identified data that is some of the output I generate for looking at our main campus versus our second campus on some clerkship level information. So what you're seeing right now is the way that I start every analysis, which is descriptive level information. In this case, it's what you're seeing are group statistics, but in other cases, you might see a lot of frequency information. So you're looking at the components of a clerkship grade, which would be a student performance evaluation, which is something that we have developed and we give all of our students. The shelf exam, I do want to comment about the shelf exam in a minute. An oral exam and a reflective essay, and the numbers there are the percentages that are contributing to the grade. Now, one thing I found in my research is that shelf exam, while generally taking up a pretty small amount of the variation in grade, actually accounts for an outsized portion of the final grade. So it's only 15% of the grade, but the weight is huge with the final grade. Now that's important. Why? Because we know that different groups of students don't do as well on exams that have test taking as a part of it. standardized assessments like shelf exams. So I'm going to show you something that kind of addresses this in a minute. But these are right here looking, you can just look at the means and standard deviations between the campuses. Oh, and I have to tell you this. Now I get very excited, so I'm going to miss some things because I love this stuff. But one of the things that I want to tell you is that part of, and I asked Anna this when I went down, your student population, you need to know how variable they are. You have to know. If you want to do any of the stuff we're talking about today, you need to know what the variation looks like in your student population. And I'll tell you why. I have a joke. So when I walk around now and I'm introduced to somebody, half the time someone will say, yeah, this is Dr. Martindale. He's the guy that says we only get one student per year. Okay? Well, that's actually true. Out of our class of almost 160, you really, on academic measures, it's really one student because they don't vary. It's incredibly difficult to find things in your data to use for learning purposes if you don't have variation. Statistics is the study of variation. So if you don't have any variation, there's nothing to study. And in our case, it's hard to find things because generally speaking, I think we have like the top 5% of college classes come to our school. And when you look at the variation in grades and GPAs and things that they bring in, it's like one person. It barely moves. That's hard. Now, that's with traditional academic measures. Where I have found, and this is an indictment on the admissions process, what I have found is much more variation in performance evaluation, performance assessment, OSCEs, for example, things like that. Okay. And you will tend to see more in things like oral exam. So for example, look at the mean here under oral exam. Okay. Don't worry about the difference in N, but look at the mean difference. That's like, over 5 percentage points different. And then look at the variation. Okay. There's a rule that we use in stats when we're doing group comparisons. When you have larger variation associated with smaller groups and larger means, that's a problem. Okay, you're getting outside the assumptions the mathematical assumptions that we use. So it also tells you right there that lower grades and wider variation are associated with that campus that has 32 students. Well, what is it about those students? That's what I'm talking about today, okay? All right, so this is actually testing, looking at differences between the campuses. Okay, so for the purpose of what we're doing today, you can just look at the two-sided p-value at the end. And what you're going to see here is that there are two assessment components here where we found statistically significant differences between the campuses. Okay, well, gee, Jim, why do you care? Because LCME says we have to care. They don't say your students have to have the exact same grades, exact same experience, but they do say you have to have comparability. So that's why we look at that. Okay, guys, it's 1 o'clock. Can anyone stay a little bit more? I'll keep talking. I have more. And I'm sorry that it's running over. If you want me to shut up, I'll shut up. But if you want to keep going, I'm available and I can also hang around for questions. I'm almost done. Okay. All right. This I'll skip. This is just showing you how you can present to, say, clerkship directors, grade distributions. But just quickly, graphically, you can see there's a difference between the two sites on grade distributions. That's important to know. And this final quantitative slide, this is what I was doing a covariance analysis for. So what I'm looking for here is we found that there was a difference between the campuses on their final clerkship grade. So one of the things I wanted to do is I would say, look, I know there was already a difference between the campuses on shelf. So the next logical question is, does that difference in final course grade remain when I remove the influence of the shelf? Okay, well, let's look and find out. If you go to shelf exam, you go across to the significance column, you'll see that shelf exam is statistically significant in terms of its variation accounted for. But look at location, which is the campus difference, 0.759. There is no difference between the campuses when you remove the influence of the shelf. So unless you're looking at this, you won't know the reasons. Okay. Psychometrics. I'm going to show you one thing that shows some of these psychometrics. This comes from our online testing system. Okay. And don't let me forget, Emily, don't let me forget, you're amazing. Differential item functioning, I just have to say a word about it or I would feel like I didn't give you the full picture. Here's a biochemistry question that our students get in their first semester. Okay. And what's important about this is you can see the distribution of responses. So 12 people went for A, 7 went for B, 136 went for the correct answer, 1 went for D. And then in the upper right, what you can see here is 87% of the class got this item correct. And this is the discrimination index, which is fine. That's not too low. That particular discrimination index is what the NBME uses. It's referred to as the corrected point biserial correlation coefficient. So that was just, that was just looking at some of the item level stuff that we look at on all of our MCQ assessments. We do it for every item. We also have the test-wise statistics as well, looking at the overall consistency of the tests. So that's important that you make use of that information. We do distractor analysis as well. So just real quickly, your distractors should be inversely correlated with the right response, something that you're going to want to think about. You get that output if you use ExamSoft. So utilize that. Okay. All right, some final thoughts then. Every time you assess is an opportunity to collect data, but you got to have somewhere to put it. Make sure you build a repository if at all possible. And you cannot know what you have unless you study it. And again, if you don't know that you have wide variability in your student class coming in, that's going to inhibit, that's going to hurt what you can do from an assessment perspective. So you have to know what you're getting in before you know what's going out and what you can produce, okay? And then this, data resources allow you to look forward and backward, and that helps psychometrically and statistically. And really the point of all of this is you want everyone to succeed, right? And so for students that may not be operating on the same trajectory, the same learning curve, and by the way, learning curves are not linear, they are generally logarithmic. So you know things about students' individual curves by using these data. Okay. All right, guys, that was exhausting for you. Thank you for hanging in there. And here's some contact information. And if I'm a little slow to get back to you, don't worry, I will get back to you, I promise. Questions. I can stick around for anyone who has questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. There's no new questions coming in, but
Oh,
really, really appreciate it. I guess I have one question.
ask away.
So when you so when the faculty look at these demographics, so when it comes to changing, they use those to change their lecture style and their teaching style?
That could be, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're not really changing assessment style necessarily.
Good.
You could, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, for example, the data informed that we needed to make a decision about how we were utilizing formative assessments. That was one thing. Another thing was knowing that our students are not exhibiting adult learning behaviors helps a lot. Knowing that having data that show attendance even. Well, if you have students that aren't coming to class, well, you need to know that they aren't coming to class, and then you can ask the question, why? And then that also gets into, well, you know, we record all of our lectures, right? Should we be doing that? Another question. Well, you know, so you can use it for multiple things. And again, I like to use it to find students that may need additional help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's kind of my underlying goal is I'm trying to find those students. Most of the,
Okay.
you know, a dean told me once, in fact, one of my mentors told me, he said, Jim, it doesn't really matter what we do to these kids when they get here, they're going to succeed. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, look at who you accept. It's all a function of who you accept. These are motivated people. These are students that have excelled. It's very unlikely that what you do is really going to change that too much. He was right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Jim, you have some questions in the audience.
Yay, ask away.
Okay, let's see. Do you have any suggestions for grading open-ended or essay assessments for large class sizes?
Yeah, I do. I have one suggestion right away, AI. I'm being absolutely serious about that. And I say that because I'm constantly concerned about the burdens that we're placing on our faculty. We put more and more and more on their shoulders all the time. So any tools that can help you, use them. So with looking at essays and things like that, all I would say is do a little research to find which LLM, so which large language models, you think would be best for the textual analysis that you're trying to do. They do differ. Prompt engineering is a big thing these days. So if you have anyone on your faculty that has experience in looking at prompts, that can also help speed up the learning curve too.
I think
And
Pascal has,
Pascal, yeah.
yeah, sorry.
Pascal.
Yeah, so I have I guess a question, because I know you talk about sharing data and it's very important, but I think the emphasis is it's actually de-identified aggregated data,
That is correct.
right? Because I always get people asking me about specific individuals in every score, and I say, no, just because you work at this institute doesn't mean protects you in this thing. And okay, because that's the one thing I constantly have is here's
Yeah,
the general profile of the class, the average score of the class,
Uh-huh.
things like that, and they want like every single detail.
Right. Now that's a great point, Pascal. There's a couple different issues at play
Yeah.
here. Because we are instituting more individualized plans and we have coaches, that's different. And so, but you can share individual data like that, but it has to be locked down. There has to be a reason for why somebody gets to see that information. So in our case, it would be a coach assigned to a student. They get to see that
Of course,
information.
yeah.
I see it because I have to analyze it. That's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Stephanie, did you have a question? Okay, there's a, let's see. Oh, there's one more there's a question in the chat. Is there a way, so having a course with different instructors, is there a way to get all instructors to agree on a desirable difficulty of items?
Oh, item difficulty?
Mm.
Yeah, I can tell you right now, there are established in the research, there are established norms for item difficulty, item discrimination, internal consistency / reliability. Internal consistency is not really reliability, but those types of test psychometrics, there are best practices for that. Just, I'll tell you with item difficulty, I use as a starting point, 0.6 to 0.8. So 60% to 80% of the students in the class getting an item correct. That's a starting point. Now, NBME has even said this, that having harder items is something you should be incorporating in your assessments. So I will actually, I look at every item, and the dean has graciously said, I have the final word on whether an item is included in a grade or not. And that's just because I do this, and most clinicians have no idea what this is, right? So I will accept a few items where only 30% of the class gets it right. But they have to exhibit other properties before I accept them, i.e. they have to be able to discriminate. Okay, so it's not one statistic or the other, it's the cumulative effect. So with something like discrimination, again, actually, let me take that back a little bit. The literature is a little wishy-washy on what the minimum discrimination should be for an item, but in general, it's 0.1 to 0.15 is where you start. Anything above that's great. But if you have items that are below that, and the reason there's variation is because it depends on which form of the discrimination statistic you're using. I use 0.1 to 0.5, and I also do that because I'm trying to give a little grace, basically, to people writing these items. It's hard. So I don't want to just be so rigid that they're like, well, I'm not writing any more items then, right? Because it is very time consuming.
Right, but we have some instructors who won't give them an item that they expect less than 95% correct on.
Wow. Yeah. May I comment on that?
I would like you to.
Yes. So here's the thing. If you give 10 items on a quiz, and you have an item that, 98% of the students are getting it right, what's the point? Statistically speaking, you've just given up a degree of freedom. Now, it's okay to have easier items. And I used to be a lot more rigid about that. But now what I do is I just tell people, look, you're going to have some easy items. And of course, what are they going to tell you? Well, I want to make sure everyone knows it. But that's not the point.
That's right. You're not assessing anything.
Exactly. That's not the point. The point is to challenge your students to learn and to think. So if you're giving them a bunch of items where everyone's getting it, then what's the point? And besides, that could have been done in a different environment. That could have been done in a group formative situation. That's
Certainly
not
could.
what you want for a summative assessment. That's the antithesis to a summative assessment, to have items like that. I generally tell our faculty, look, the bulk of your items should be somewhere in the middle. Let's expand the difficulty range to say, maybe 50 to 85%. We can make that up because different contexts do have slightly different numbers. You can have a few super easy items, fine. I generally say anything over 95% is worthless. Don't do that. But if you have a couple in the 90s like that, fine. If you have a couple that are down in the 30s and 40%, fine. But for all those items, they have to discriminate. If they don't discriminate, then the discussion is over.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Believe me, I hear it all the time. Every time a new faculty member comes into the curriculum and they haven't done this before, I have to do the same lecture over and over. This is now like 15 years I've had to do that. So, yeah, okay.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. This was awesome.
You're so welcome. Yeah. I know I get riled up with all this stuff, so I apologize if I was like, blah, 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 blah. I've only had one cup of coffee, I promise. So, and thank you for not asking me any biochemistry questions. I haven't had biochemistry in 35 years. So it's all I can do to remember what a carbon chain is. So yeah, but you guys were fantastic. So I really appreciate you having me, and please feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you for staying a few minutes over. So
hot
it was
topic,
yes.
Assessment is a hot topic.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe we'll think about including that as a future big theme in the Professional Development Committee webinars
there you
in the
go.
upcoming semesters. Well, thank you, everyone. And our last webinar from this series is scheduled for April 10th. So I hope to see you all in about a month. And if you have spring break this week, next week, the upcoming weeks, have a great spring break.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Good luck to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.